You're listening to the September 18th, 2015 edition of the Cybercrime and Business Podcast, the weekly podcast that's focused exclusively on how the world of cybercrime is impacting business. This week's guest is Lisa Beegle, the Information Security Manager at Akamai Technologies. Akamai's PLXsert team has been observing a cybercrime group that's been threatening businesses with DDoS attacks. Since April 2015, the team has observed 114 of these DDoS for Bitcoin attacks, and we're going to be chatting with her a little bit later about those attacks. Hello, I am Jeff Peters, Surfwatch Labs editor, and I'm here with Matt Leifus, Surfwatch Labs writer. We'll have that interview with Lisa Beegle coming up at the end of the podcast, but first we'll be recapping this week's top trending cybercrime events, advisories, and legal actions from the past week. Throw it over to you, Matt, to get started with the cybercrime events that were trending.
Surfwatch Labs collected data on 90 industry targets negatively associated with cybercrime over the past week, and another 258 being discussed in the dark web. From this data, we get our top trending industry targets for the week. So coming in at number 3 based on that data, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, or CMS for short, notified about 7,600 job applicants that the school district was the victim of a data breach. The school district emailed the applicants last week, letting them know that some of their personal information could have been compromised. Some of this information includes names, addresses, and social security numbers. The data was compromised by a third-party vendor after an employee from the school district entered into an agreement with this vendor without obtaining authorization from the school. The vendor, who is unnamed at this point, used the information to create a CMS database of applicants for a specific learning community. Hence, that's how the data was compromised. CMS said in a letter that they are working with the unnamed vendor to ensure the sensitive information was destroyed and is taking measures to prevent any additional release of information. Coming in number 2, we have RSA Home Insurance and Lloyds Bank. RSA Home Insurance, which is a company that provides emergency home insurance for premier account holders at Lloyds Bank, had a data storage device stolen, which led to the compromise of customer data for both companies. RSA confirmed the device was stolen on July 30th. Information on this device included names, addresses, account numbers, and sort codes for customers. Lloyds Bank Premier customers who opened an account between 2006 and 2012 are the ones who are affected. And coming in at number 1, we have a real mess of a situation here. An employee from Vodafone Australia accessed the phone records of Natalie O'Brien, who is a journalist from Fairfax. The company has admitted to this hack, but they deny any, quote, improper behavior. Internal emails suggest the company deliberately misled authorities about systemic privacy breaches. Here's some information to recap what's going on here. A series of stories were published by Natalie O'Brien in 2011 that detailed, quote, grave security lapses in Vodafone's Siebel data system, revealing that customers' home addresses, driver's licenses, and credit card details were all available online. A Vodafone employee, which we talked about, accessed O'Brien's phone call and text records to reveal company whistleblowers. Again, trying to see, who's giving out this information. The thing about this that makes this story interesting was there's an internal email from Vodafone that suggests the company was aware of this lack of security that O'Brien wrote about. And they were also talking about the potential fallout either from the legal side or reputation damage if they were caught hacking O'Brien's phone records. So a little bit of a mess there. We'll have to see how all that plays out. But those are the top trending industry targets for the week. To kick off discussion this week, Jeff, I see you did a lot of research and you brought this up a little earlier today. I like how you kind of brought it up. Let's talk about China. So we talk about China a lot. What's going on now?
I'm just, like I said before on the podcast, I'm just really fascinated by this dynamic and how it's playing out. But first, before we get into the whole politics of it all, what really sparked this topic was on Tuesday, Trend Micro released a report. The report's called Operation Iron Tiger, exploring Chinese cyber espionage attacks on United States defense contractors. So just a little bit about that report. In the report, they detail this group of Chinese-based threat actors that are known as Emissary Panda or Threat Group 3390. And this group has been stealing terabytes of confidential data from employees of U.S. companies since 2013. Specifically, what this group is targeting are directors and managers of companies in the electric, aerospace, intelligence, telecommunications, energy, and nuclear engineering industries, among others. So what they do is they steal emails, they've stolen full Active Directory dumps, intellectual property, strategic planning documents, budget or finance-related content, all that kind of good stuff that China's always getting accused of stealing. And I guess just one stat that was kind of interesting that Trend Micro wrote about in their blog, just to give a sense of how big this theft is, in just one case, the attackers were able to make off with 58 gigabytes of data, just from a single compromised organization. And if you think back to the Sony Pictures Entertainment breach, which everyone was talking about, one of the biggest breaches of the year, the entire cache of stolen information released there was 40 gigabytes. So this one instance is larger than that, and they're talking about potentially terabytes of information being stolen. So this report, it's not everyone's known about this group. I think in August, Dell researchers, they put out a report on the group as well. And the group's been around since 2010, but they kind of shifted these tactics in 2013. But I thought it was interesting what Trend Micro's Christopher Budd, he said that the big picture story is that cyber warfare is increasingly murky and the line between state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored actors is blurring.
Yeah, and it wasn't long ago, maybe 2 podcasts ago, maybe last week. I can't really remember at this point. Jeff and I kind of get involved in a lot of this. But we were talking about proposed sanctions from the United States against China. And there were several different points of criteria that had to be met for some of these sanctions to qualify. One bit of information from this that's key. We're constantly talking about China. It seems like from what I see, we attribute so many different attacks to China. Well, this kind of puts a face on some of the activity that does happen. And when we're talking about these proposed sanctions that the United States, they're thinking about moving forward with, this is why. That is a lot of information. Really think back to when we're talking about Sony Pictures. And it was just the biggest thing for, 3 months or something like that. That's all anyone talked about. And one single act that was documented in this report was bigger than that.
What I find interesting is there's been all this talk about sanctions, and no one's really officially commented on it. It's just been anonymous sources and different stuff. But on Wednesday, Obama was quoted in a CNN article I saw. He said, quote, "We are preparing a number of measures that will indicate to the Chinese that this is not just a matter of us being mildly upset, but is something that will put significant strains on the bilateral relationship if not resolved." He said, "We are prepared to take some countervailing actions in order to get their attention." And the Chinese president is coming into town to visit with President Obama next week. So President Obama said that this will probably be one of the biggest topics that he discusses with the Chinese president during that meeting that's going to occur next week. And he said, "We have repeatedly said to the Chinese government that we understand traditional intelligence gathering functions that all states, including the U.S., engage in, but that this is a fundamentally different approach where the government and its proxies are engaging directly in industrial espionage and stealing trade secrets." So just something that's been playing out for the last couple of years, and it's just interesting to see where it goes in the next couple of weeks.
This has been building up for a while here. Just a little recent timeline. In May 2014, the Justice Department indicted 5 Chinese military officials for allegedly hacking several U.S.-based companies. Then in April 2015, which we discussed a few weeks back in the podcast, like I said, President Obama signed an executive order allowing the U.S. to sanction entities who engage in or benefit from cyber-enabled economic espionage. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Are we going to move forward with some of these sanctions, or how are we going to react?
Yeah, so those were some of the big cyber events and stories for the week. Now moving on, we'll get to the advisory portion of our podcast, where we recap some of the top advisories and alerts that came out over the past week. There was a report, probably a little more than a week ago, by USA Today. According to documents obtained by the paper, They said that hackers have successfully compromised the U.S. Department of Energy computer systems 159 times in a 4-year period. The records were obtained by USA Today through the Freedom of Information Act. The Department of Energy reported 1,131 cyber attacks in that 4-year span.
That's quite a bit.
Yeah.
And another advisory I saw out there had to do with a distributed denial of service tactic, or DDoS. Research conducted by Newstar highlights changing tactics in DDoS attacks. Cybercriminals are deploying smaller, more repeated attacks to distract an organization's security and IT teams, while malware is installed to steal trade secrets or valuable data. Newstar research found that around 40% of attacks are relatively small, at less than 5 gigabytes per second, so they're kind of being used as like a smokescreen to do something else. I think we've talked about that before.
Coming up at the end of the podcast, we're going to have an interview with Akamai where we talk about another way DDoS attacks are being used, this group that's using them to extort people for Bitcoins, the DDoS for Bitcoin attacks. So that'll be coming up in a little bit. But one other advisory that popped out, last week we were talking a little bit about stuff that was going on Android, and we've been talking about extortion. This week, researchers at ESET, they discovered the first malware that could allow an attacker to reset the PIN of anyone's phone to permanently lock them out of their own device. The malware is called Locker Pin. Hackers can use this malware as a type of ransomware, and they're spreading it from an adult entertainment application called PornDroid, which I think we might have mentioned on last week's podcast. No, that was a different porn thing. We're just always talking about porn.
Oh, well, hey, why not?
So this malware is getting spread from this adult entertainment application, and like most ransomware attacks, around $500 is being demanded in order for the user to gain access back to their phone. So those were some of the advisories. I know there was a couple of alerts, specific alerts that Surfwatch Labs alerted to the customers this week, right, Matt?
Yep, Surfwatch Labs put out 2 different alerts this week. The first one had to do with an ATM malware. A new ATM malware dubbed Souseful is capable of seizing all credit and debit card track data, reading from the chip of the card and stopping ATM detection sensors. Researchers have said that Souseful can be manipulated via the ATM keypad, and that the malware is also capable of holding or rejecting payment cards. The second alert had to do with CoreBot malware. CoreBot, thanks to additional modules, has evolved into a serious piece of banking malware. The malware is now able to interact with Google Chrome, Firefox, and the Internet Explorer in order to steal form details. Additionally, there is a virtual network computing module to enable remote control. This evolution has built-in pre-configured URLs to target banks, as well as web injection mechanisms. Finally, as if it wasn't bad enough, it's also capable of performing man-in-the-middle attacks. So news just keeps on coming with that one.
Moving on to the legal news from the past week, there's a couple of stories I wanted to update you guys on quick. The first story is a follow-up to this recent insider trading that was connected to the theft of press releases at PR Newswire, Business Wire, Market Wired. The Ukrainian-based company Jasmine Capital Partners and its CEO were accused of generating over $100 million in profits over a 5-year span that used these stolen press releases. I think there was about 150,000 of them. So these 2 defendants are the first to settle with the SEC, and they have agreed to pay a $30 million settlement. And I believe there was 35 total defendants, so we'll probably be getting more news on that in the future. And then another story that's been kind of ongoing for a long time. Prosecutors are in talks with a second suspect who is suspected of being involved in this JPMorgan Chase hack. A court filing was made public in Manhattan Federal Court, which said that Anthony Murgio of Florida was in discussions regarding a possible disposition of this case.
Yeah, other legal news we have. Russia is charging Google for violating anti-monopoly laws. Google could potentially face charges from Russia over its insistence that OEMs bundle prominent Google apps onto Android smartphones. Because of this, Google is violating Russia's anti-monopoly laws. The charges are in the works after Russia's Federal Anti-Monopoly Service followed a complaint from Yandex, which is a competitor of Google that also develops apps and maintains its own Android app store. And then finally, we had more Target news. These guys just seem they are not going away anytime soon. On Tuesday, a judge certified a class action for banks affected by the 2013 Target breach, saying the banks could pursue their claims together over the breach. Banks already compensated by the previous $67 million settlement with Visa are not eligible to participate in the lawsuit. But again, Target's just, they're in for another long ride apparently, because lawsuits, they're not done. Doesn't seem like anytime soon.
So those are some of the top cyber events, advisories, and legal events for the past week. Before we get to the interview, I'll throw it over to you, Matt, to lighten it up a little bit with our funny cyber story of the week.
Before I get into this, I just want to point out that, Jeff, if you don't mind me speaking for you, you've played online poker.
Yeah, I used to play quite a bit. Me and my brother got into it, and before they passed the laws and made it illegal in the United States to play on the sites.
Yeah, I used to play a lot myself. As a matter of fact, from tournament winnings from PokerStars, I actually made enough money to buy my wife her engagement ring, which is kind of a neat story I get to tell people. Jeff and I were talking about our days playing poker, and one thing that you'd sit back and laugh about was it just seems like no matter what you did against some of these players, like they just always seemed to know exactly what was going on, and you would think, you'd chuckle to yourself, are they cheating somehow? Did you ever run into that, Jeff? I know I did. There are so many times I would flop something and have a straight, and there's just no way they know that. And just they fold at the right times, whatever. It was horrible.
It seemed like everyone would always be accusing these sites of cheating and having bots and things like that in order to siphon money off the top.
Well, I got to tell you, Jeff, after reading this article, as it turns out, a little bit of cheating could have been actually going on here. According to researchers from ESET, a new piece of malware was discovered that targets online poker players. It is used to cheat in online poker by peeking at the cards of infected opponents, taking a screenshot of the infected player's hand. The screenshot shows the player's hand and the player's ID, which is important because this player ID, that actually informs the hacker when you're on one of these sites. And so they try to get onto your table and see what you have. This malware specifically targets two of the biggest online poker sites around, which is PokerStars and Full Tilt Poker. So, like I said, if you're at the receiving end of a really bad beat, or you seem to be up against a player that is making all the right moves, maybe you guys should check your computer for infections, because you could be infected with this malware. I'm just saying, I think the cards are stacked against us, Jeff. This malware out there, I want my money back. I just can't believe this.
Well, that's what all the bad poker players say, is the good poker players know it's just you not playing the cards right.
Yeah, right,
not some crazy conspiracy full of hackers. But I'm sure there's some of that going on out there.
You put all your chips in the middle with just because you have a pocket pair and you lose, that's your own fault.
Now moving on, we have our interview with Lisa Beegle, the Information Security Manager at Akamai Technologies. And we discuss some research that Akamai's PLXsert team has done on DD4BC, a group that's been extorting organizations by threatening DDoS attacks unless they pay up with bitcoins. On the podcast last week, we mentioned the DD4BC group briefly, but just wondering if you could give us a quick recap of what the group is and how they operate.
So DD4BC is a group that showed up in around September of 2014, and they are a DDoS for extortion basic group. So they send notification to organizations that either they pay or they will go ahead and orchestrate an attack against the organization.
The recent breakdown showed that 58% of the attacks were against financial services organizations.
Correct.
Like bank and credit unions, currency exchanges, payment processors. So is that a noticeable shift from what you guys saw with previous attacks from them?
Yes. So obviously we saw them emerge against kind of gaming customers, those types of organizations, and then that was a rather drastic shift overall into the banking organizations later on in the campaign.
And has there been anything else that's changed over the past year with them?
I would say the overall methodology has changed. So previously they were doing kind of one vector attacks, and then they started to actually change the attack to multi-vector. They were also using a greater level of visibility, it seemed to be, against the organizations to be able to monitor impact to them. And then we saw obviously the increase overall in the number of attacks as time went on.
Obviously, DDoS extortion attacks, not necessarily a new kind of thing. So just wondering, this group's getting a bit of coverage recently in the media, wondering how this DD4BC group stacks up against other groups and in terms of threats to businesses.
I would say the biggest thing that stands out the most is one is the duration of the overall campaign itself. So this is definitely a named campaign that has gone on for a continued period of time. So that is unusual. The other thing is the credibility associated with it. So that in each one of these notifications, we did see that there was follow through from the group as it related to attack activity.
Yeah, and I was kind of laughing because reading your guys' report, it says the group claims it can generate up to 500 gigabit per second attacks. And obviously it seems like all these hacking groups have these big claims, but I think the highest you guys saw was 50. Is that right?
Yeah, about 56, I think, was the highlight campaign in the report.
Maybe for those who don't really know, how big is a 50 gigabit per second attack in terms of, if you're attacking a financial organization?
I mean, again, at the end of the day, I think one thing that I don't want to focus on overall is just the bandwidth component, because at the end of the day, if I come at you in different ways from an application perspective or at the router, that sort of thing, the bandwidth can be important, but there are also other ways that I can cause a level of collateral damage against an organization outside of just the bandwidth.
One of those ways I saw you guys are talking about how this group is now threatening to expose a targeted organization via social media. Said the goal is to publicly embarrass the target, thus harming the company's reputation. I found that interesting because I was thinking back to, say, like 2014, there were some DDoS attacks against like Basecamp, Meetup, Elance. And in those cases, there was kind of the first time I really saw where there's a lot of people publicly saying, hey, we're being extorted. And it seemed to almost get kind of a positive spin out of it. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that kind of social media aspect that the group is trying to threaten people with.
So I don't see it as being positive, and that's something that we actually have gone through with many organizations. A lot of organizations don't want anybody to know that they've come under attack. So there is a great level of discretion with some of these organizations in that regard. It's very rare that you do see organizations from a credible perspective, especially if you're looking at financials, stating that we're under a DDoS attack. And the other thing is it opens them up to other opportunists the minute that they actually announce it. So they may be targeted by one organization, but the minute that they make that announcement, somebody else may come in and try and do something else to the organization on the back end.
I'm not sure if you can necessarily answer this question, but it just seems to me like I've interviewed quite a few people about extortion attacks, and it seems like everyone always says that this has always been a pretty significant problem, especially, as a percentage of the DDoS attacks they see. But it seems like it's getting a lot more coverage in the media now. So just wondering if you think that these extortion attacks are becoming more prevalent and affecting more businesses, or if it's just that we're more aware of them and reporting on them more?
Obviously they have always been around, right? That's where a lot of the mitigation actually stems from, is the fact that it was the extortion campaigns. So I think that a lot of it has to do with the increased coverage and the overall visibility to these types of attacks is why you're probably seeing more coverage. And I think that that'll continue.
A while ago, we interviewed some people about ransomware, and we were kind of surprised that some of the experts were saying in some situations it might be a good idea to pay the ransom. Obviously, DDoS extortion is different, but is there any situation where you guys think it would make sense to pay a DDoS extortion? No,
I do not think that it makes any sense for any organization to actually pay the ransom. There are no guarantees that they're not going to be impacted by an attack at some point. And again, it also makes them vulnerable to other actors if they do.
If an organization doesn't pay, they get attacked. What happens next? At least in terms of with this group, is it a sustained attack that happens over a long period of time, or do they move on to the next target fairly quickly?
So we've typically seen them move on to the next target very quickly. Usually the longest duration that we had seen was about an hour overall. And some of that depends on the end user's mitigation strategy and that sort of thing, as far as them moving on. Typically, if they see that there is no level of impact against the organization, they'll rapidly move to the next target.
You come into work and you find an email from a group like this, and you're obviously worried. What do you do at that point?
At that point, if you have DDoS mitigation services, my suggestion is that the organization move their traffic to that service immediately. They should take the threat as being a credible threat and that they will have a level of impact.
And as any kind of overall advice in terms of people who are worried about DDoS attacks or extortion and, in general, just to what they should be doing, what they should be planning for?
Yeah, I mean, this is a recommendation to any organization. I mean, they should have a playbook, and they should be executing that playbook. They should be doing kind of walkthroughs quarterly in order to ensure that the mitigation services are as they expect them to be, that they have everything that they need to be able to identify and protect their overall infrastructure as far as resources and that sort of thing. And then they'll be better prepared to make decisions instead of losing time and moving to actual mitigation if they do receive any type of threat like this.
Anytime there's a successful attack in the cybercrime world, we get a lot of copycats and stuff like that. And obviously this group's getting a bit of coverage, so do you anticipate this type of threat growing in the coming months?
I think that, again, you'll see continued activity in this regard. I can't tell you to what degree, but yes, because of the level of success that they have had and the fact that there probably are some copycat actors based on some of the changes within the overall emails and that sort of thing. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
All right, no worries. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.
And that'll do it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. The Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. You can follow this podcast on iTunes, YouTube, and all the major podcasting sites. And if you want more information, check out surfwatchlabs.com.